Hello, in this video, I'll introduce you to JavaScript functions, how to write them and how to use them. Let's get started. Welcome back. In this video, we are going to cover everything that you should know about writing JavaScript function, and in particular, the foundations, principles of writing JavaScript functions. We're going to discuss on the various things that you'll come across when you're writing functions in JavaScript or when you're reading other people's code. Let's begin now. On my desktop here, I have a VS Code instance open and a live server on my right. I have an app.js and an index.html file, which we're going to use to test our code. I have linked the JavaScript file to using this script tag to this HTML index file. So back to my app.js file, the first principle when you're writing JavaScript function, I'm presuming you're from a complete beginner to advanced concept. So I'll begin with the most basic. I can first begin by the first should be the keywords used in JavaScript function. Then we need to look at parameters, and in particular, how in JavaScript you pass parameters by value. Then we need to look at calling functions, how functions are called. Then the fourth is hoisting. The fifth is the scope. Then the sixth, this should be function scope. Then the sixth is recursion, when a function calls itself. Then the seventh is closures. And of course, this goes along, it's simply like nested functions. This should be functions. So these are some of the most important things that you need to understand for you to be comfortable writing JavaScript functions. I'm going to cover each and every one of these concepts, explaining with a specific example. So let me begin now. Here we begin with the keywords that we use to define functions in JavaScript. This is the first thing that we're going to cover. In JavaScript, we define functions by writing the word function, then giving the name of the function, then these brackets to pass parameters, and inside the function we can do a return statement that gives us the value of the function. We can return a string. So that's basically how to write a function in JavaScript. And if you tested this function, you'd need to call the function for it to work. Functions must be called for them to work. These brackets, you can pass parameters. For example, you can do a string, which is going to be your variable. Then in here, you can do string equals to this. Then we return that. So we are defining the function using this function keyword, giving the function the name, then adding some parameters in here. Then inside here, we can now use these parameters that we passed. Then the return keyword is used to give us the value of that. Let's console log that to see what happens. I'd like to bring up this console, then I save this, and this is output in the console. This is the basic way to define a function in JavaScript. The function keyword and the return. The function keyword is used to define the function, then the return keyword is supposed to give us the value of the function. So that's the first basic principle of writing functions in JavaScript. The next is passing parameters, like I have passed parameters in the first step. Parameters in JavaScript functions are passed by value. So what does that mean? We can pass parameters. We can write a function to do maths, add numbers. Then we can pass two numbers, x and y. Then in here, we can do our return, and the return will be the sum of the two numbers. Then we can now pass any numbers. We can do add numbers, then we pass in any values like 45 and 89. Then we can console log this. This function, we are passing two parameters, x and y. Then in here in the return, we are adding the two numbers. Whenever I call this function, I'll have to pass the parameters. Once I save that, I get the sum of the two numbers. So this can be used as many times as possible. It's a principle that you need to understand that has something to do with how we pass parameters in JavaScript. We pass them by value. What does that mean? So let me get rid of this. Then I begin by creating a constant here. Then I call it person object. Suppose we have a person object here, which is going to be equal to, we give them a name. The name can be Smith, then the age, 23. Then here we can have a function that takes in this object. So like get name. This function can take in this object, then it gives us back the name. It can take that object, then we get the name. I want to pay keen attention to, we can change the name inside this function. We can use this function to change the name. We can access this object by the dot notation. So object dot name, we can access the property, the name property of this object by this dot notation. So person object dot name should now be equal to, we can now change this to Joe Doe. Once we change that, down here we can now do a console.log. Then we pass this object dot name. It's giving us Smith because it's accessing back here this object property. But once we now call, this is what makes a difference. We now call the method first, get name, then we pass the object, then we now access the name from the object. So it gives us Joe Doe. So it means like we are accessing this variable outside this function due to the fact like in JavaScript parameters are passed by value. That's a quick example to explain how parameters are passed by value. The third is calling function, which I've already explained, but I'll go ahead and explain again. So suppose we have a function, then message, then this message takes in some parameter. So maybe we can just call it unique message. Then we can return here. It's just a simple function. We return just the same value here. For this function to ever work, must be called for them to be executed. So you cannot just write a function and expect it's going to execute. So it needs to be called. So you need to just do the message, then you pass in the message you wish. So then we can console log this to see what happens. This is how you call a function in JavaScript. And you should not forget that a function needs to be called for it to execute. You can't write a function and not call it, else it's not going to execute. So that's another principle of writing functions in JavaScript. So let's comment this out. The fourth is hoisting. Hoisting is the order in which declaration of the function and the time it's called. Hoisting is about the order in which you call the function and when you declare it. It also applies in variables. For example, we can call the function first with the function name greet. Then we define the function here. Then we pass the message. Then in here we return the message. So this is the function declaration. Then this is the function call. In the normal way, we are supposed to declare the function first, then we call the function later. Like this is supposed to be down here. But in some cases, we might call the function first, then we declare it later. So JavaScript supports hoisting, functional hoisting. So that's the concept. So we can do a console log here and pass a message, then we save. And it works, despite the fact like this function is declared later. So that's the concept of hoisting in functions. The other concept is the functional scope. The scope of the function means the behavior of variables or properties inside functions and outside functions is going to be different, or functions that are called within the function, or in general, just the properties of our functions behave differently depending with the scope. So I'd like to begin by creating a function here. Then I can just call it example of a function. Then this function has a variable, call it x, which is equals to 10. Then in here, I can access that variable. Maybe I can say console log x. I can access that variable. But if I try to do this outside the function, suppose I copy that outside the function, it's going to give me a reference error. So let's save this and see. It gives me a reference error. X is not defined because X is not defined within this scope. Because now inside these curly brackets, that's where X is defined. If I did this, I can so log that the X is now defined. But in this context, since X is inside the function, it's within the functional scope, it's not accessible outside. But if I have a global variable, if I move this x here, then I console log this function here. We have the x as a global variable, so this function can access this. I would like to change this to a different value, and we see it logs because this function can access this global scope at this particular point, but outside here, a function declared in a variable declared inside a function, you cannot access it. So that's another concept you need to pay attention to when you're writing functions in JavaScript. So we move to the next one, which is recursion. Recursion is the concept of a function calling itself. The best way to explain recursion is, suppose I have a function here that displays the name. So it takes in two parameters, the name and the times. The number of times is going to display the name. So for example, we are having a function that we'd like to it to call or to do x number of times. In here, the first argument will be this. I think we can make this instead of time, we make it times. If this is what in recursion you'd call a base case. If the times are strictly equal, three equal sign compares both the type and the value is equal to 0, we want to return. That will kill the recursion. Then now down here, we can now do the recursive call. Do the recursive call here. So we can call the name, the function, we can call it, then pass these parameters. So we call this function inside itself, then we pass the name, then for the times, we pass times -1. I'd like to test this function in the console. So in between these two cases, I want to console log the name. Then outside the function, we now call the function. We don't need to now console log it. Because we have already done this inside here. So in here, I pass the name, which is a string. Then I would like to call this 5 times or 3 times, whichever amount of times. So once we call the function, it's going to execute this console log. Because we have already set these times, like we have this guard clause here. It prevents this function running when the times are set to 0. We have set to 5, so we expect this function to call itself and at least print out 5 times. I would like to save that, and you can see on the console it calls and it prints 5 times. So this is what a recursion function is. In JavaScript, functions can call themselves. That's another principle you need to pay attention to when you're creating functions in JavaScript. The other concept is closures and nested functions. Closures are very important when you're writing large applications. You're going to come across nested functions and closures many times. What are closures? So in closures, you cannot talk about closures without understanding the ability of JavaScript to nest functions, for functions to be nested. For example, we can have a function here. We begin with the outer function. We create a function. We just call it outer function. This outer function has a variable in here. This will call it outer scope variable. So then we'll say var name is equals to. So this variable belongs to the outer function. Then we can add a nested inner function inside a function. This is a nested function. So we declare the function here, we call it inner. Then in this inner function, we can just console log the name. We are declaring the name here, which this variable belongs to this outer function. Then in this inner function, this inner function has access to this variable. But if we declare the variable in here, like second name, this outer function would not access this. So that's something you need to understand when you're dealing with closures or nested functions. The idea is we are trying to have the inner function accessing the properties of the outer function when you have nested functions. So back to this, I console log this name, this variable, since I have access to it in this inner function. Then once I console log it here, I can now do a return outside now this function. I can return this inner. Then we now test the function. Let's see what happens. So to test it, we need to first create a variable and we call it inner function. So that's to test and see if the access to variables is going to work. So this is going to be equal to the call to the outer function. Then down here, we can now call this inner function. Because this is a function, we can call it, and our expectation is it's going to log this on the console. And as you can see, it does print this in the console. We can try and change this to, and it works. So this is a perfect example of two nested functions. We have an outer function and an inner function. Then the inner function has access to this variable. And now once we return this inner function and call the functions out here, we are able to get the right results. So that's what a closure is in JavaScript. That's generally the concept of closures in JavaScript. By the end of this video, you should now be comfortable writing and using functions in JavaScript. If you found value in this video, kindly consider giving it a thumbs up and do not forget to subscribe. Thank you.